Picture this. A team of biologists studying deep-sea vents discovers a species of tube worm thriving in conditions that should be lethal according to virtually every rule biology textbooks have established for what life supposedly requires. No sunlight, crushing pressure, water hot enough to boil at the surface, chemicals that would poison almost any other organism on the planet. Yet these worms aren't just surviving, they're flourishing, completely rewriting what scientists thought they understood about the boundaries of possible life. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of years earlier, a small band of ancient humans was busy doing something equally rule-breaking in its own way, developing behaviors and capabilities that shouldn't have made evolutionary sense according to the standard playbook every other species on the planet seemed to follow. Evolution has rules: survival of the fittest, gradual adaptation, ruthless competition, genetic self-interest above all else. But every once in a while, a species comes along that seems to completely ignore the rulebook and somehow thrives anyway. So let's break down exactly which species broke evolution's unwritten rules and why ancient humans deserve a serious spot near the very top of that list. Let's start by establishing what these supposed rules of evolution actually are, since understanding what's being broken requires knowing the baseline expectation first. Evolutionary theory generally predicts that organisms will behave in ways that maximize their own genetic success, often at the expense of unrelated competitors. Traits and behaviors that don't directly contribute toward survival or reproduction should theoretically get filtered out over time, since organisms carrying costly, non-beneficial traits typically get outcompeted by those without that particular disadvantage. Cooperation, when it exists, usually only extends toward close genetic relatives, following predictable patterns researchers call kin selection. Resource competition should be fierce and largely self-interested. These aren't arbitrary assumptions. They're patterns confirmed repeatedly across millions of documented species throughout the natural world. And yet, certain species have found ways to bend, stretch, or outright ignore these expectations while somehow still thriving evolutionarily, which is exactly the kind of contradiction that makes biology endlessly fascinating rather than a simple, predictable formula. Let's work through several rule breakers before circling back toward ancient humans and examining exactly why our own species deserves recognition as perhaps the single greatest evolutionary rule breaker of them all. Let's begin with naked mole rats, since these bizarre, wrinkly creatures represent one of the most legitimately strange departures from typical mammalian evolutionary patterns found anywhere in nature. Naked mole rats live in large underground colonies structured almost identically toward insect societies like bees or ants, complete with a single reproductive queen while the overwhelming majority of colony members remain non-reproductive workers for their entire lives. This arrangement, called eusociality, is spectacularly common among insects but almost unheard of among mammals, since mammalian reproduction typically doesn't lend itself easily toward this kind of extreme self-sacrifice for the benefit of a single breeding individual. From a purely traditional evolutionary standpoint, this shouldn't make much sense. Why would the vast majority of individuals within a colony completely sacrifice their own reproductive success to support just one breeding female? The answer, once researchers worked it out, actually reinforces evolutionary logic rather than breaking it entirely, since colony members are typically extremely closely related, meaning supporting the queen's reproduction still indirectly passes along shared genetic material even without personal reproduction. Still, the sheer extremity of this arrangement, being almost unique among mammals specifically, makes naked mole rats a fascinating example of evolution finding an unusual, rule-bending solution that works remarkably well despite initially appearing to violate typical expectations regarding individual reproductive self-interest. Now let's discuss something mind-bending: the immortal jellyfish. This particular species possesses a unique biological ability to essentially reverse its own aging process under certain environmental stress conditions, transforming back into an earlier developmental stage rather than simply dying of old age like virtually every other complex organism on the planet. This represents such a profound departure from typical biological expectations regarding aging and mortality that researchers are still working to fully understand exactly how this reversal process functions at a cellular level. Death, biological decline, and eventual mortality represent such universal, seemingly unavoidable features of complex life that discovering a species capable of essentially sidestepping this fundamental rule feels almost like finding a loophole nobody thought actually existed within life's basic operating system. Let's shift towards something considerably more relevant toward our broader discussion regarding cooperation specifically: vampire bats. Since their behavior directly challenges traditional assumptions regarding purely self-interested resource competition, vampire bats require regular blood meals to survive, and missing just a couple consecutive feeding opportunities can prove fatal given their extremely fast metabolism. Remarkably, researchers have documented vampire bats regularly regurgitating blood to share with colony members who failed to successfully feed on a given night, including, in many documented cases, completely unrelated individuals rather than exclusively close genetic relatives. This represents reciprocal altruism extending beyond simple kin selection, meaning vampire bats are essentially operating a functional social safety net based on reciprocal trust and mutual benefit rather than purely self-interested or purely genetically motivated behavior. Bats that consistently share blood with others develop ongoing reciprocal relationships, receiving similar generosity during their own future lean nights. This cooperative system, extending meaningfully beyond close genetic relation, represents an interesting departure from the stricter, more narrowly self-interested cooperation patterns evolutionary theory typically predicts. Now here's where we can properly connect this discussion back toward ancient humans, since everything we've explored so far regarding rule-bending cooperation actually helps set up just how extraordinarily far ancient humans pushed this particular evolutionary boundary compared toward virtually every other species discussed throughout this exploration. Where vampire bats represent an interesting but relatively modest departure from strict self-interested behavior, ancient humans developed cooperative behavior so extensive, so consistently reliable, and so central toward their entire survival strategy that it fundamentally reshaped what evolutionary success even looked like for our species compared toward the rest of the animal kingdom. Let's dig into specifically why ancient human cooperation represents such a dramatic evolutionary rule break. Most cooperative behavior throughout nature, even impressive examples like vampire bat reciprocity or naked mole rat colony structure, remains fairly narrowly constrained, typically limited toward close family groups or relatively small, tightly bonded social units. Ancient humans, by contrast, developed cooperative behavior extending across considerably larger social networks, including extended family groups, allied neighboring communities, and eventually complex trade and resource-sharing relationships spanning across substantial geographic distances between groups that weren't closely related genetically at all. This expanded cooperative scope required unprecedented cognitive and social infrastructure. Ancient humans needed sophisticated communication capable of conveying complex social information, reliable methods for tracking reciprocal obligations across extended time periods, and cultural mechanisms for enforcing cooperative norms even when direct genetic incentive wasn't present. Essentially, ancient humans built an entirely new evolutionary strategy centered around cultural and social technology rather than purely genetic self-interest. A strategy that proved remarkably successful precisely because it allowed for cooperation at a scale most other species simply never achieved. Let's talk about something particularly fascinating regarding how ancient humans specifically broke evolution's typical rules surrounding caring for non-reproductive or reduced reproductive value individuals. Standard evolutionary logic suggests that once an individual's reproductive contribution becomes minimal or ends entirely, continued investment of group resources towards supporting that individual should decrease correspondingly, since resources spent supporting non-reproductive members represent resources not spent supporting active reproduction elsewhere within the group. Yet, ancient humans consistently supported elderly community members well beyond their reproductive years, an arrangement researchers specifically identify as unusually rare compared toward typical patterns observed throughout the broader animal kingdom. This elderly support system, sometimes called the grandmother effect within evolutionary research, actually reveals something clever, hiding beneath what initially looks like rule-breaking behavior. Elderly community members, despite reduced or absent personal reproduction, provided enormous practical value through accumulated survival knowledge, childcare assistance, and various other contributions that ultimately increased overall group reproductive success even without personal reproduction from the elder themselves. This represents a sophisticated evolutionary workaround, technically maintaining underlying genetic self-interest logic while completely transforming what that self-interest actually looked like in practice compared toward almost every other species throughout nature. Now let's examine something worth exploring regarding ancient human disability and injury support, since this represents perhaps one of the most striking examples of apparent evolutionary rule-breaking found within the entire archaeological record. Skeletal remains discovered at numerous ancient sites show clear evidence of serious injuries and disabilities that would have made independent survival impossible without substantial, sustained assistance from other community members, sometimes for extended stretches spanning multiple years. Standard evolutionary evolutionary logic would predict abandonment of severely disabled individuals, since supporting someone unable to contribute meaningfully toward group survival represents a resource drain without obvious corresponding genetic benefit. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Yet, evidence consistently shows ancient human communities choosing to support these individuals anyway, across numerous different sites, time periods, and geographic regions. This pattern appears frequently and consistently enough that it clearly represents intentional cultural practice rather than occasional anomalous behavior. Researchers studying this phenomenon generally conclude that ancient human cooperative instinct extended beyond narrow calculation regarding immediate practical value, representing authentic social and emotional investment that occasionally exceeded what strict genetic self-interest alone would predict or require. Let's touch on something worth appreciating regarding how ancient human technological development itself represents another significant departure from typical evolutionary patterns. Most species adapt toward their environment through gradual, purely biological evolutionary change occurring across many thousands or millions of years. Ancient humans, by dramatic contrast, developed the capability toward adapting their environment toward their own needs instead, through tools, fire, clothing, and shelter construction, essentially allowing cultural and technological adaptation toward occur considerably faster than traditional biological evolution ever could accomplish on its own. This represents a profound rule break worth sitting with properly. Rather than waiting for biological evolution toward slowly develop thicker fur for cold climates or stronger claws for defense, ancient humans simply invented clothing and weapons instead, achieving comparable or even superior functional results within a single generation, rather than requiring the countless generations typical biological adaptation usually demands. This technological workaround essentially allowed ancient humans toward bypass traditional evolutionary timescales entirely for many crucial survival challenges, representing an entirely different category of adaptation compared toward virtually every other species throughout evolutionary history. Now, here's something particularly interesting worth exploring regarding ancient human population expansion and environmental range compared toward typical species distribution patterns. Most species remain relatively confined toward specific environmental niches they've become biologically specialized toward inhabiting successfully. Ancient humans, however, managed toward successfully populate an extraordinarily diverse range of environments, from freezing Arctic conditions toward blistering desert heat, from dense tropical rainforest toward open savanna grassland, using cultural and technological adaptation rather than requiring distinct biological specialization for each dramatically different environment. This represents unusual evolutionary flexibility compared toward almost every other complex species throughout the natural world. A polar bear, however successful within its specific Arctic niche, simply couldn't survive within a tropical rainforest environment without undergoing dramatic biological change across countless generations. Ancient humans, by contrast, successfully colonized environments this dramatically different using essentially the same basic biological toolkit, supplemented specifically through cultural knowledge, technology, and social cooperation rather than requiring fundamental biological transformation for each new environment encountered. Let's talk about something worth appreciating regarding language development too, since this represents another unique evolutionary development that dramatically separated ancient humans from typical evolutionary patterns observed throughout the rest of the animal kingdom. While plenty of species communicate through various calls, gestures, or chemical signals, ancient human language development allowed for abstract, symbolic communication capable of conveying complex ideas, planning future actions, and preserving detailed knowledge across generations through oral tradition rather than requiring direct, immediate experience for learning to occur. This represents an unprecedented evolutionary tool, essentially allowing knowledge itself toward become a form of inheritance passed between generations independent of genetic transmission. A skilled ancient hunter could teach crucial survival knowledge directly toward the next generation through language and demonstration, meaning valuable adaptive knowledge no longer required countless generations of trial and error toward develop and refine. This cultural transmission mechanism operated at speeds traditional genetic evolution simply couldn't match, representing yet another significant way ancient humans essentially found a workaround toward typical evolutionary limitation and timeline. Now let's consider something worth pondering regarding how all of these various rule-breaking adaptations worked together synergistically within ancient human evolutionary strategy, rather than existing as separate, isolated developments. Extended cooperation allowed for successful group hunting of dangerous, otherwise inaccessible prey. Technological adaptation allowed for environmental flexibility beyond typical biological limitation. Language allowed for rapid knowledge transmission across generations. Elder support and disability care reinforced strong social cohesion that made all this other cooperative behavior reliable and sustainable over extended periods. Each individual rule break reinforced and amplified the others, creating a unique evolutionary strategy that proved remarkably successful, specifically because it operated according to fundamentally different principles compared toward the strategies most other species relied upon throughout evolutionary history. Let's briefly circle back toward some of the other rule-breaking species we explored earlier, since comparing them directly against ancient human evolutionary strategy reveals something worth appreciating regarding scale and integration. Naked mole rat eusociality, while remarkable, remains confined toward a single, relatively specialized biological strategy centered specifically around colony structure. Vampire bat reciprocal altruism, while interesting, remains limited toward a single cooperative behavior around blood sharing rather than representing comprehensive social restructuring. Immortal jellyfish biological reversal, while mind-bending, represents a purely biological adaptation without any accompanying social or cultural component whatsoever. Ancient humans, by contrast, developed multiple simultaneous rule-breaking adaptations working together across cooperation, technology, language, and social support systems, creating a comprehensive evolutionary strategy that touched virtually every aspect of how our species interacted with both environment and each other. This comprehensive, multi-layered rule-breaking approach likely explains why ancient humans eventually achieved such extraordinary evolutionary success compared toward other individually impressive but more narrowly specialized rule-breaking species throughout the natural world. Let's consider something worth exploring regarding the risks and costs associated with this rule-breaking evolutionary strategy too, since it's worth acknowledging this approach wasn't purely beneficial without any accompanying trade-off or vulnerability. Extended cooperation requires trust and reliable reciprocity, meaning communities remained vulnerable toward exploitation from individuals willing toward accept cooperative benefit without contributing fair reciprocal effort themselves. Supporting elderly and disabled community members required resource investment that could strain group survival during particularly difficult periods facing severe resource scarcity. Technological and cultural adaptation, while faster than biological evolution, still required successful knowledge transmission across generations, meaning losing crucial knowledge holders through sudden death or disaster could threaten a community's accumulated adaptive advantage. Despite these risks and trade-offs, ancient human rule-breaking evolutionary strategy proved remarkably successful overall, eventually allowing our species toward achieve population growth and environmental range that dramatically exceeded what more traditional, narrowly self-interested evolutionary strategies typically produce among comparable species. This success wasn't guaranteed or inevitable. It required countless successful generations navigating exactly the kind of risk and vulnerability inherent within this cooperative, technologically dependent evolutionary approach, successfully balancing cooperative benefit against potential exploitation, and successfully maintaining crucial knowledge transmission across generations despite disruption risk from disease, conflict, or environmental catastrophe. Now here's something worth appreciating as we work toward wrapping up this exploration. Modern humans today represent the current culmination of this unusual evolutionary experiment our ancient ancestors essentially pioneered across countless thousands of years. Every act of cooperation extending beyond immediate family, every piece of technology allowing us toward inhabit environments our bodies couldn't naturally survive within otherwise. Every piece of knowledge passed down through language and teaching, rather than requiring direct personal discovery, represents direct inheritance from this rule-breaking evolutionary strategy ancient humans developed and refined across our species' long, complicated history. Let's wrap up by considering something worth appreciating regarding what this entire exploration ultimately reveals about evolution itself, beyond simply cataloging which species broke which specific rule. Evolution, despite generally predictable patterns observed across millions of documented species, apparently contains flexibility for entirely novel strategies toward emerge when circumstances allow. Naked mole rats found their own unusual path toward evolutionary success through extreme colony cooperation. Vampire bats found theirs others through reciprocal generosity extending beyond genetic relation. Ancient humans, arguably more dramatically than any other species discussed throughout this exploration, found an entirely comprehensive evolutionary strategy built around cooperation, technology, and cultural knowledge transmission that fundamentally reshaped what evolutionary success even meant for our particular species compared toward the rest of life on Earth. So, which species truly broke evolution's rules most dramatically? While every example we've explored throughout this discussion represents fascinating departure from typical evolutionary expectation, ancient humans arguably deserve recognition as the single most comprehensive rule breaker of them all, precisely because our ancestors didn't just bend one specific rule the way naked mole rats or vampire bats did. They fundamentally reimagined multiple foundational evolutionary principles simultaneously: cooperation, resource allocation, environmental adaptation, and knowledge transmission, weaving them together into an entirely new evolutionary strategy. That proved remarkably successful precisely because it operated according to different underlying logic compared toward almost every other species throughout the natural world. Next time you help a stranger, teach a skill toward someone younger, or simply benefit from technology allowing you toward comfortably survive in a climate your body couldn't naturally handle without assistance, take a moment toward appreciate that you're directly participating in the same rule-breaking evolutionary strategy your ancient ancestors pioneered across countless difficult generations. That cooperative instinct, that capacity for cultural adaptation, that reliance on shared knowledge rather than purely individual discovery, none of it was evolutionarily guaranteed or inevitable. It represents an unusual evolutionary gamble that somehow paid off spectacularly well, eventually leading directly toward the technologically advanced, deeply cooperative species writing and reading content exactly like this one today. If exploring these evolutionary rule breakers shifted how you think about ancient human development and our species' unusual evolutionary path, imagine how many other remarkable departures from typical biological expectation remain waiting throughout both the natural world and our own complicated evolutionary history. Stick around, because there are countless additional stories from nature and from humanity's ancient past that reveal just how creative, surprisingly flexible, and remarkably rule-bending evolution truly can become when circumstances allow an entirely new strategy the chance toward finally prove itself.